Great apes today come in three sizes. There are the big boys, the chimps and bonobos, weighing in at 35 to 70 kilos. Then there's me, somewhere in between. And then there are the orangutans, which can be absolutely massive, especially the males, who can weigh over 90 kilos. But our ancestors weren't like any of these. They were smaller than all of them, but they still walked upright on 2 feet and had human-like hands and feet. They also looked remarkably modern, not really ape-like at all. So how did we go from those ancient ancestors to the great apes we know today? We can answer that question by heading back 5.5 million years ago. Welcome to my channel. 5.5 million years ago, our ancestors were well on their way to becoming us. This was about 500,000 years after the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees lived. And during that time, a lot of changes occurred. Some scientists think that this is when the first species in the genus Homo emerged. However, others disagree, saying that Homo sapiens didn't appear until about 2.8 million years ago. Regardless of whether or not they were quite human yet, they certainly walked like us. But 5.5 million years ago, there was another hominid walking around that scientists are pretty sure was definitely not a human. It was a type of Australopithecine. These were much more ape-like than we are, with shorter legs and a much bigger posterior for sitting on their haunches. But they too walked upright on 2 feet. The trouble is that scientists don't know what any of the Australopithecines looked like because none of their skulls have ever been found. All that's left of them are some bones from their spines, legs, and feet. One of these specimens comes from a place called Hadar in Ethiopia. It was found in 1976 and was given the nickname Lucy. Lucy's skeleton was 40% complete and showed that she had a small brain and a body that was overall ape-like but adapted for walking upright. Lucy was dated to be 3.2 million years old, so 5.5 million years ago would have seen her relatives who were probably even more ape-like. So if our ancestors walked like this and looked like this, what changed? Well, part of the reason why it's so hard to say what our ancestors looked like is that humans do not preserve like mummies or fossils like the Egyptian pharaohs. Our bodies are made up of about 18% protein and collagen, which breaks down quickly. Instead, we get preserved through our skeletons, which aren't always found completely intact. Our ancient ancestors would have looked very similar to us, but with longer arms than is typical today, along with a larger neck and head relative to our body size. They wouldn't have had the pronounced chin that you and I have either. These features would evolve later as our ancestors moved into new environments and adapted to new lifestyles. But it wasn't just our body shape that changed. We got smarter, too. Scientists used to think that the increase in human intelligence happened pretty quickly in our evolutionary history, but recent studies suggest that it was actually a gradual process that started a lot earlier than we thought. Our ancestors had brains about 40% larger than modern chimpanzees, which may not sound like much, but the average chimp brain weighs only about 350 grams. 40% of that is only 140 grams. But the important thing isn't the absolute size of our brain, it's the difference in size between our brain and our body. In other words, our encephalization quotient, or EQ. The EQ measures how much of an animal's brain is devoted to processing sensory information versus how much is needed for basic life functions. Animals with higher EQs tend to be smarter. Chimpanzees have an EQ of about 2.4. Humans, on the other hand, have an EQ of 3.5. A large EQ means that we need a bigger brain for our body size than other animals. This allows us to do some pretty impressive things like write symphonies and Land Rovers on Mars. But it also means that we need to eat more food to fuel our hungry brains. Chimpanzees spend about 7 hours a day looking for food. Humans only spend about 2 hours a day looking for food. That's because we've developed technologies to help us find food, but also because our guts have shrunk. Compared to other apes, ours are tiny. This is because our brains and our guts take up the same amount of energy to power, so as one organ gets bigger, the other has to shrink. Our ancestors were probably smart enough to realize that their growing brains needed more fuel. So maybe they cooked their food to make it easier to digest and free up more energy for the brain. That's about twice that of a dog, which makes sense because we all know that chimps are a lot smarter than dogs. Cooking also kills bacteria, meaning that they might have had fewer gut parasites, requiring a smaller gut. It seems likely that our ancestors, along with our growing brains, also developed more complex language abilities. They wouldn't have sounded quite like Shakespeare, but they could have communicated with each other about where to find the best berries or how to use a rock as a hammer. This brings us to our next major change, migration. About 12 million years ago, the forest in which our ancestors lived began to split apart. Where once there had been a single large forest, there were now many smaller ones separated by grassland. Our ancestors would have had to adapt to living in different habitats like dry savannas and dense woodlands. Perhaps some groups of apes used the grasslands to travel from forest to forest, much like some chimpanzees do today. If our ancestors were already using tools and cooking their food, this would have given them an advantage as they traveled. They would have been able to use those tools to hunt wild game or forage for plants, and cooking their food would have prevented them from getting sick from eating spoiled meat. The groups of apes that migrated would have reproduced and died out, but the ones that survived would have eventually populated the entire continent of Africa, becoming the various types of Australopithecines. The most famous of these is Australopithecus afarensis. You might recognize that name. It was the species to which Lucy belonged. Unfortunately, like I said before, we don't know what Lucy's species looked like since no skulls have ever been found. But based on the bones we have from them, scientists think that Australopithecines were a lot more ape-like than we are, with shorter legs and a much bigger bottom. They also had relatively long arms, suggesting that they spent a lot of time climbing trees. Meanwhile, our ancestors were getting smaller, not taller. It's a bit counterintuitive since we generally think of ourselves as the pinnacle of evolution and therefore the ultimate life form. But being small actually gave our ancestors an advantage. They could climb trees and evade predators while also having shorter gestation periods and needing less nutrition during pregnancy. They could also enter new environments faster than the big boys, allowing them to adapt to new situations more quickly. Smaller body size might not seem like much of an advantage in today's world, but remember, our ancestors lived alongside big cats, bears, and other predators that would have loved to sink their teeth into a juicy, nutrient-rich ape. By this point in our evolutionary history, our ancestors were starting to look and act like us. They walked upright, had human-like hands and feet, and used tools. They were also smaller than today's great apes and had shrunk even further from our ape-like ancestors. But one important trait was still missing. They hadn't quite grown big brains yet. The apes we see today came in one size. Well, okay, maybe two if you count the bonobos and the chimps as separate. But compared to 5.5 million years ago, today's great apes come in half as many sizes. So what happened? Well, the bonobos and common chimpanzees we see today are about 40 kilograms, but fossil evidence suggests 5.5 million years ago, chimps weighed about 50 kilograms. Bonobos are a bit smaller, so they probably weighed about 40 kilograms. Orangutans, meanwhile, were about 30 kilograms lighter than they are today. This means that over the past 5.5 million years, they've gotten about 50% bigger. Gorillas were also much smaller 5.5 million years ago, but they got even bigger than they are today. The adult males of today weigh about 180 kilograms. But scientists think that 5.5 million years ago, they weighed about 250 kilograms. That's about the size of a polar bear. But why did the great apes get so big? Part of it had to do with the environment. 5.5 million years ago, the world was warming up. As the temperature rose, so did the biomass of forests. More biomass means more food. And a ready food source meant that the great apes could grow larger bodies, which allowed them to attract mates and ultimately pass on their genes. Another factor was sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism refers to the difference in size between males and females. Take gorillas as an example. Male gorillas are called silverbacks because when they reach maturity, a silvery patch of hair grows on their back. Female gorillas don't have this patch. Silverbacks can be nearly twice the size of the females in their group. Having a big male in charge helps protect everyone, especially the young. A dominant male can ward off intruders while the females search for food. Likewise, a large female is good for protecting offspring from predators. During the Miocene, the age of apes, there were lots of predators. There were saber-toothed cats, giant crocodiles, and even a couple of species of Ankylosaurus. So being bigger certainly had its advantages. Today, the great apes live in much smaller groups and face fewer predators. It's possible that their large size evolved simply because it takes a big ape to attract a mate. Some scientists speculate that orangutans got big so males could intimidate one another with their size and drive rivals away from their food. Gorillas, meanwhile, are thought to have gotten big to establish dominance in their groups. Male gorillas will beat their chest and scream to assert themselves, so maybe the bigger the gorilla, the more intimidating they become. So there you have it, a potted history of our closest living relatives and how they evolved over the past 5.5 million years. What do you think? Did anything surprise you? Let me know in the comments section below. And be sure to stay tuned for more videos. See you next time.